I, 26, F, stood at the edge of my mother's grave, watching the last of the mourners drift away into the gray afternoon. The cemetery stretched out before me, row after row of headstones marking lives that had ended, stories that had concluded. But my mother's story, I would soon discover, was far from over. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving everything damp and glistening. Water droplets clung to the roses people had left, making them look like they were crying. My black dress felt heavy against my skin, the fabric still damp from standing in the earlier drizzle during the service. Most of the attendees had already retreated to their cars, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of grief that hung over the cemetery like fog. That's when Clara, 28, F, my stepsister, approached me. Her heels clicked against the stone pathway with a rhythm that sounded almost cheerful, completely at odds with the solemnity of the occasion. She had changed since the service, trading her modest funeral dress for something that looked more suited for a business meeting. Her blonde hair, which had been pinned up earlier, now flowed freely over her shoulders. There was something in her walk, something in the way she carried herself that made my skin crawl. "We're finally rid of her," Clara said. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I turned to look at her, certain that I must have misheard, certain that even Clara, with all her coldness and cruelty over the years, couldn't have said something so heartless at our mother's graveside. But the expression on her face told me I had heard correctly. There was no grief there, no sorrow, no trace of the loss that should have marked this day. Instead, there was something that looked horrifyingly like satisfaction. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara's blue eyes, inherited from her father, met mine without flinching. "You heard me, Rachel. We're finally rid of her. This family can finally move forward now. No more dealing with her constant needs, her medications, her doctor's appointments. No more watching her deteriorate day by day. It's over." The rage that bubbled up inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. My hands clenched into fists so tight that my nails dug into it made me pause. "You always were too trusting, Rachel. Too willing to believe what you were told." Before I could respond, before I could demand to know what she meant by that cryptic comment, Clara turned and walked away. Her departure was as casual as if we had been discussing the weather rather than my mother's death. She joined her father, my stepfather, Richard, who was waiting by a black town car. He put his arm around her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that looked rehearsed, mechanical. They both got into the car without looking back at me, leaving me alone by my mother's freshly filled grave. The cemetery groundskeeper approached me after a few minutes, gently suggesting that they would be closing soon. I nodded, taking one last look at the temporary marker that bore my mother's name until the permanent headstone could be installed. Margaret Ann Walsh, it read. Beloved wife and mother. The words seemed inadequate to capture who she had been, what she had meant to me. As I walked to my own car, Clara's words echoed in my mind. "We're finally rid of her." It wasn't just the cruelty of the statement that bothered me. It was the confidence with which she had said it. Like she had been waiting to say those words. Like she had been planning them. The next morning, I arrived at Richard's house early. He had made it clear at the funeral that I needed to remove all of my mother's belongings within the week. The house that had been my home from age 11 until I left for college now felt foreign to me. The walls seemed darker, the hallways narrower. Every room held memories of my mother, but also memories of how she had changed in her final years, growing weaker, more confused, more dependent on Richard and Clara for everything. I started in her bedroom, the master suite she had shared with Richard until her illness made that impossible, and she had been moved to a guest room on the first floor for easier access. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume, a light floral scent she had worn for as long as I could remember. Her clothes hung in the closet, organized by color the way she always kept them. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, filled with pieces both valuable and sentimental. As I packed each item, memories flooded back. The blue silk scarf she had worn to my high school graduation, insisting on attending even though she could. Looking at it now, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his hand on her shoulder looked more like restraint than support. It was while going through her desk drawers that I found the first indication that something was terribly wrong. The desk was an antique, something my mother had inherited from her own mother. She had always been meticulous about organizing her papers, but the desk seemed to have been searched recently, items displaced and hastily put back. In the back of the bottom drawer, underneath old tax returns and insurance documents that looked like they had been rifled through, I found a manila envelope that had been taped to the underside of the drawer. The envelope was marked, "Important. Keep safe," in my mother's distinctive handwriting. But the writing looked shaky, unsteady, like she had been struggling to control the pen. Inside were medical records I had never seen before, documents that should have been with her other medical files but had been deliberately hidden. The records were from 3 years ago, showing that my mother had visited Dr. James Morrison, a toxicologist at a hospital 2 hours away from our town. The appointment notes were detailed and disturbing. My mother had presented with symptoms that didn't match her diagnosed autoimmune condition: hair loss, severe gastrointestinal distress, peripheral neuropathy, and cognitive confusion. Dr. Morrison had noted his concerns about potential heavy metal poisoning and had ordered specific tests. But there were no test results in the file, no follow-up appointments. The paper trail simply ended. I sat on my mother's bed, the papers trembling in my hands. Poisoning. The words seemed to echo in the quiet room. Why would my mother have seen a toxicologist? Why hadn't she told me about this appointment? And why were these records hidden rather than filed with her other medical information where they belonged? I pulled out my phone and searched for Dr. Morrison's contact information. His office was still listed at the same hospital. Without hesitating, I called and spoke to his receptionist, explaining that I was Margaret Walsh's daughter and that I needed to speak with the doctor about my mother's case urgently. The receptionist, hearing the distress in my voice, managed to squeeze me in for an appointment the following Tuesday. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Clara's words at the funeral, seeing her satisfied expression, remembering return to Richard's house. I had legitimate reason to be there, still packing my mother's belongings, but this time I had a different purpose. I waited until I knew both Richard and Clara would be at work. Richard ran a successful financial consulting firm downtown, and Clara worked for him as a senior analyst. They were creatures of habit, always at the office by 8, never home before 6. I let myself in through the back door using the key I still had. The house was silent, dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight that streamed through the windows. I started my search in the kitchen, the room where my mother had spent so much time in her final years. Even as her strength faded, she had insisted on trying to cook family dinners, maintaining some normalcy in a life that had become anything but normal. I went through every cabinet methodically, not entirely sure what I was looking for. The dishes, the glassware, the regular array of spices and condiments all seemed normal. But in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one that required a step stool to reach, I found something odd. There were several bottles of supplements and vitamins, all with Clara's name on the prescription labels, but one bottle stood out. It was labeled as vitamin D, but the pills inside looked different from the others. They were slightly off color, a bit larger, and had no manufacturing marks that legitimate pharmaceuticals should have. I pocketed several of the pills, my heart racing. If these were what I suspected they might be, if they had been giving these to my mother disguised as vitamins or mixed with her regular medications, it would explain everything. I moved on to Richard's study, a room I had rarely entered even when I lived in the house. Richard had always been particular about his privacy, claiming he dealt with sensitive client information that needed to be kept secure. The door was locked, but it was an old house with old locks. A bobby pin and a few minutes of fumbling got me inside. The study was exactly what you would expect from a successful financial consultant. Dark wood furniture, leather-bound books that looked like they had never been read, expensive-looking artwork on the walls. His desk was meticulously organized, everything in its place. I started with the unlocked drawers, finding nothing but standard business documents and correspondence.
but the bottom drawer was locked separately, with a newer, more secure lock.
Barely leave her bed. How had they even gotten her to sign the documents? Or had they forged her signature? But the insurance policies were just the beginning. Underneath them were documents related to my mother's inheritance from her parents. My grandparents had been wealthy, leaving my mother nearly $2 million when they passed away 10 years ago. The money was supposed to be held in trust, providing for her medical care and ensuring her financial security. But according to these documents, Richard had convinced my mother to sign power of attorney over to him 2 years ago, citing her declining cognitive function due to her illness. Since then, there had been systematic transfers from the trust into accounts controlled by Richard and Clara. Large sums, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, all documented with vague explanations like medical expenses and household maintenance. But I knew my mother's actual medical expenses had been covered by insurance, and the household expenses couldn't possibly account for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been drained from her accounts. I took photos of everything with my phone, making sure to capture every detail, every signature, every transfer. My hands were shaking so badly I had to retake several photos to get them clear. They had been robbing her. While she lay dying, while she depended on them for everything, they had been systematically stealing her money. I heard a car in the driveway and my blood froze. It was too early for Richard or Clara to be home, but someone was definitely here. I quickly closed the drawer, making sure everything looked undisturbed, and slipped out of the study. I grabbed a box of my mother's books from the living room, trying to look like I had just been packing, and headed for the back door. I could hear voices from the front of the house as I slipped out the back. Clara's voice, sharp and agitated. "Dad, we need to talk about Rachel," she was saying. "She's been here too much. What if she finds something?" "There's nothing to find," Richard's voice replied, but there was an edge to it that suggested he wasn't as confident as he wanted to sound. "We've been careful. Let her pack up Margaret's things and leave. After that, we'll change the locks and be done with her." "She was always too close to Margaret," Clara said. "What if Margaret told her something? What if she left some kind of message?" Margaret was barely coherent at the end. Deceased's caregivers. I slipped away from the house, my heart pounding. They knew there was something to find. They were prepared for the possibility that I might discover something, which meant they had definitely done something that needed to be hidden. I spent the weekend researching everything I could about heavy metal poisoning, particularly thallium poisoning. The symptoms matched my mother's decline perfectly. The hair loss she had attributed to her medication, the severe stomach problems the doctors couldn't explain, the nerve damage that left her unable to walk, the confusion that Richard had used to justify taking control of her finances. Every symptom that had been dismissed as part of her autoimmune condition could also be explained by chronic poisoning. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. I arrived at Dr. Morrison's office an hour early, sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot and going over everything I had discovered. I had organized all the evidence on my phone: the photos of the financial documents, the insurance policies, notes about the suspicious pills I had found. I had also brought the pills themselves, sealed in a plastic bag. Dr. Morrison was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When I introduced myself as Margaret Walsh's daughter, his expression immediately became serious. "I remember your mother well," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "Her case has bothered me for 3 years. Please, tell me what happened." I explained everything: her death, the lack of autopsy, the immediate cremation, Clara's comment at the funeral, and what I had discovered in my investigation. Dr. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your mother came to me because she suspected she was being poisoned. Her symptoms were classic indicators of chronic thallium exposure. It's a heavy metal that used to be common in rat poison but has been banned for consumer use for decades. It's odorless, tasteless, and causes symptoms that are often misdiagnosed as other conditions." "Did you test her for it?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I wanted to," he said. "I ordered the tests immediately and told her to come back the next day for blood and hair samples.
but she called that afternoon to cancel.
Concerns. I pulled out the plastic bag with the pills. I found these in the house. They're supposed to be vitamins, but they look suspicious to me. Dr. Morrison examined them carefully, then looked up at me with alarm. These need to be tested immediately. If these contain what I suspect they might, this is evidence of attempted murder at minimum. With your mother's death, it's murder. How long will the test take? I asked. I can rush them given the circumstances. 2 days, maybe 3. In the meantime, have you considered going to the police? With what? I asked. Suspicious pills and financial documents? They'll say the pills are just vitamins until proven otherwise, and the financial stuff could be explained away as legitimate use of power of attorney. You have my testimony about your mother's visit and her suspicions, Dr. Morrison said. That has to count for something. Would it be enough for them to exhume her body? I asked. Oh, wait, they can't. Richard had her cremated within 24 hours of her death. No autopsy, no chance to test for poisoning. Dr. Morrison's face darkened. That's extremely suspicious in itself. Was your mother's death expected? Yes and no, I said. She had been sick for years, but her death was sudden. One day she was stable, the next she was gone. The doctors said her body just gave out, that it happens with chronic illness sometimes. Or it happens when someone increases the dose of poison, Dr. Morrison said quietly. The weight of his words settled over me. They hadn't just been poisoning her, they had killed her. When she got too close to the truth, when she started to suspect, they had increased the dose and finished her off. I'll test these pills immediately, Dr. Morrison said, and I'll document everything from your mother's visit 3 years ago. When you have enough evidence, I'll testify to what I know. Your mother deserves justice. I left the hospital with a strange mix of hope and dread. Hope that I might actually be able to prove what Richard and Clara had done. Dread at the confrontation that was coming, at the reality of what they were capable of. That evening, I called my mother's sister Anna, who lived across the country. We had always been close, but the distance had made it hard for her to visit during my mother's illness. Rich 5, I said. Car accident. That's what everyone was told, Anna said, but Margaret said she found something that suggested otherwise. She wouldn't tell me what over the phone. Said she didn't trust that the calls weren't being monitored. She was going to write me a letter explaining everything, but I never received it. What else did she say? She said that if anything happened to her, you should look into Caroline's death. Caroline was Clara's mother. She said the pattern was important, that Richard had done it before. My blood ran cold. You think Richard killed his first wife too? I don't know what to think, Anna said, but your mother was convinced of it. And now she's dead too. After we hung up, I went to the library and searched through newspaper archives from 23 years ago. It took hours of scrolling through microfilm, but I finally found the article about Caroline Walsh's death. The headline read, "Local woman dies in tragic accident." The article described how Caroline Walsh, 32, had died when her car went off a cliff on Mountain Road. She had been returning from visiting her sister in the next town. Weather conditions were clear, and there were no witnesses to the accident. She left behind her husband Richard Walsh and their 5-year-old daughter Clara. But it was a follow-up article from a week later that caught my attention. Caroline's sister, Diana Morrison, was quoted as saying that Caroline had been planning to divorce Richard and had been afraid for her safety. She claimed that Caroline had evidence of Richard embezzling from his employer and was going to use it in the divorce proceedings. But the police found no evidence of foul play, and the case was closed as an accident. A year later, there was one more article. Diana Morrison had continued to push for the case to be reopened, claiming she had evidence that Richard had tampered with Caroline's car. But the evidence was deemed circumstantial, and without any witnesses or concrete proof, the case remained closed. Diana eventually moved away, and the story faded from public memory. I printed out all the articles, adding them to my growing file of evidence. The pattern was clear now. Richard had killed before, and Clara, whether she knew it or not as a child, had grown up in the shadow of that murder. Had she figured it out at some point? Is that why she had helped him kill my mother? My phone rang, breaking through my thoughts. Together, we went to the police station. Detective Sarah Mills was the officer assigned to our case. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She listened carefully as Dr. Morrison and I laid out the evidence: the poisoned pills, the financial documents, the life insurance policies, the previous suspicious death of Richard's first wife. "This is certainly compelling," Detective Mills said when we finished. "But I need you to understand that building a murder case without a body is challenging. The cremation complicates things significantly. But the pills are evidence of attempted murder at least," Dr. Morrison said. "And with the financial motive and the pattern of behavior, surely that's enough to arrest them." "It's enough to get a warrant," Detective Mills said. "We'll search the house, look for more evidence. If we find what we need, we'll bring them in for questioning. Ms. Walsh, I'll need you to provide a formal statement about everything you've discovered." I spent the next 3 hours giving my statement, going over every detail, every piece of evidence, every suspicious behavior I had witnessed. Detective Mills asked probing questions, making me clarify timelines and relationships, building a comprehensive picture of what had happened. "One more thing," she said as we finished. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay? If Richard and Clara realize you're onto them, you could be in danger." I hadn't thought about that. I had been so focused on getting justice for my mother that I hadn't considered my own safety. "I have a friend I can stay with," I said, thinking of my college roommate Sarah, who lived an hour away. "Good. Stay there until we make the arrests. We'll execute the search warrant tomorrow morning." I left the police station feeling a mixture of relief and fear. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard and Clara wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, staying at Sarah's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother's final months, how she must have felt knowing or suspecting that the people caring for her were actually killing her. How alone she must have felt. How terrified. And yet she had managed to hide evidence, to leave a trail for me to follow. Even dying, she had been fighting for justice. "The next planning this out. Have you arrested them? We're bringing them in now." Richard was at his office. Clara tried to run when she saw us coming. That's consciousness of guilt right there. The news of the arrests made the local papers immediately. "Prominent businessman and daughter arrested in murder plot," read the headline. The article detailed the charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. It mentioned my mother by name, describing her as a victim of a calculated and cruel plot by her own family. But the real bombshell came 2 days later when Clara broke under interrogation. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, she turned on Richard, claiming it had all been his idea, that he had forced her to help. And then she revealed something that changed everything. Detective Mills called me to come to the station. "Clara is talking," she said. "She's confessing to everything, including something we didn't know about. You need to hear this." I sat in a small viewing room, watching through one-way glass as Clara, looking haggard and defeated in her orange jumpsuit, told her story. "My father killed my mother when I was 5, Clara said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I didn't understand it then, but I knew something was wrong. He made me promise never to tell anyone what I had seen." "What did you see?" Detective Mills asked. "I saw him under her car the night before she died," Clara said. "He told me he was fixing something, but I heard him on the phone later, telling someone that it was done and it would look like an accident. I was too young to understand, but as I got older, I pieced it together." "Did you ever confront him about it?" "When I was 16, Clara said. He admitted it. Said she was going to leave him, take everything, take me away from him. He said he did it to protect us, to keep our family together. He made it sound reasonable, like he had no choice." "And Margaret? Your stepmother?" Clara's face hardened. "She found out about my mother. I don't know how, but she found evidence. She confronted us 3 months before she died. She had a letter my mother had written to her sister before she died, talking about the divorce, about being afraid of my father. Margaret said she was going to the police of attorney to move the money to set everything up. But something went wrong. Clara nodded. She figured it out. She was always smarter than we gave her credit for. She went to that toxicologist, Dr. Morrison. When we found out, we had to act fast. Father intercepted her when she got home, convinced her that he had found a better specialist, that he was just trying to help. She wanted to believe him. Even suspecting what we were doing, she wanted to believe that her husband loved her. So you increased the dose? We had to. She knew too much. Even if she didn't have proof, she could have convinced someone to investigate. So we tripled her daily dose. She was dead within a week. And the cremation? That was Father's idea. Destroy the evidence. Make it impossible to prove murder without a body to test. I watched this confession with tears streaming down my face. My mother had been murdered slowly, deliberately, by people she had tried to love, and Clara spoke about it like it was a business transaction, a problem to be solved. But Clara wasn't done. There's more, she said. Father has done this before. Not just my mother. There was an aunt who died 10 years ago, left him money. A business partner who had a heart attack 15 years ago. He's been killing people for money his whole life. Detective Mills leaned forward. Are you willing to testify to all of this? Yes, Clara said, but I want a deal. I was a child when he killed my mother. He raised me to be like him, taught me that this was how you survived in the world. I'm a victim too. I wanted to scream. Clara? A victim? She had cold-bloodedly planned and executed my mother's murder. She had watched her suffer for 2 years, had administered the poison with her own hands, had stood at her funeral and gloated about it. And now she wanted to paint herself as a victim? But the legal system worked in mysterious ways. Clara's lawyer argued that she had been psychologically damaged by witnessing her mother's murder as a child, that Richard had groomed her into becoming his accomplice. The prosecution, wanting to ensure Richard's conviction, offered Clara a deal. 30 years with the possibility of parole in exchange for her full cooperation. Richard, faced with Clara's testimony and suddenly, leaving him a small inheritance. The business partner whose death had allowed Richard to take over the company, even a college girlfriend who had died in a suspicious accident after breaking up with him. He was a serial killer who would use different methods to avoid detection, but always for the same motive: money and control. After the sentencing, I did something I never thought I would do. I went to visit Clara in prison. I needed to understand why she had said those words at the funeral, why she had felt the need to be so cruel. Clara sat across from me in the visiting room, her blonde hair now showing dark roots, her face pale and drawn without makeup. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. Why did you say it? I asked. At the funeral. Why did you say, we're finally rid of her? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, because I wanted someone to know. I wanted someone to know that we had won, that we had gotten away with it. I was proud of what we had done. It was the perfect crime. Except it wasn't, I said. You got caught. Because of you, Clara said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. I didn't think you had it in you. You were always so soft, so trusting, just like your mother. My mother figured you out, I reminded her. She found evidence about your mother's death. She stood up to you. And look where it got her, Clara said. But there was less venom in her voice now, more weariness. She got justice, I said. Maybe not for herself, but for your mother, for all of Richard's victims. She did that. Clara's face crumpled slightly. My mother, I barely remember her, just fragments. Her smell, her voice singing lullabies, and then she was gone. And Father told me she had left us, that she didn't love us anymore. It was only later that he told me the truth, that she had died in an accident. And later still when I learned it wasn't an accident at all. You could have gone to the police when you found out, I said. With what proof? And he was my father. He was all I had. He had made sure of that. Isolated me from my mother's family. Told me they were dangerous, that they wanted to hurt me. By the time I dealt with the legal aftermath, Since Richard and Clara's crimes had been exposed, all of the stolen money was returned to my mother's estate, which I inherited as her only legitimate heir. The life insurance companies refused to pay out, given the circumstances of her death. But I also inherited everything Richard owned, as the court awarded me damages in a civil suit. I sold Richard's house immediately. I couldn't bear to be in those rooms where my mother had suffered, where they had slowly poisoned her while pretending to care for her. Every corner held a terrible memory now, tainted by the knowledge of what had really been happening. The kitchen where Clara had crushed thallium into my mother's food. The living room where Richard had sat beside her, holding her hand while she grew weaker from the poison he was administering. The guest bedroom where she had died, alone and frightened, knowing her killers were in the next room. The sale of the house, combined with the returned funds and the civil judgment, left me with more money than I knew what to do with. Blood money, in a way. Money that had cost my mother her life. I couldn't bring myself to use it for personal benefit. Instead, I established the Margaret Walsh Foundation for Victims of Elder Abuse and Family Violence. The foundation would provide resources for victims, fund investigations into suspicious deaths, and advocate for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults. I also used some of the money to hire a private investigator to track down Diana Morrison, Caroline's sister. She had moved across the country after the police refused to reopen Caroline's case, but I felt she deserved to know that she had been right all along. It took the investigator 3 weeks to find her. Diana was living in a small town in Oregon, working as a librarian. When I called her and explained who I was and what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I knew it," Diana finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew Richard had killed her. But no one would listen. The police said I was just grieving, that I was looking for someone to blame. They made me feel like I was crazy." "You weren't crazy," I said. "You were right. And because of my mother's investigation into Caroline's death, Richard is finally paying for what he did." Diana broke down crying. We talked for over an hour, and she shared memories of Caroline, details about the fear her sister. We met in person a month later. Diana flew out for the unveiling of my mother's permanent headstone. She was in her 60s now, gray-haired and soft-spoken, but I could see the family resemblance to the photos I had seen of Caroline. She brought boxes of Caroline's things she had saved all these years: letters, photographs, journals. "I kept everything," Diana said. "I always hoped that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. Your mother did that. She got justice for Caroline." The headstone was beautiful. Black granite with gold lettering. "Margaret Ann Walsh," it read. "Beloved mother, seeker of truth and justice." Diana and I stood there together, 2 women connected by loss and by the courage of my mother who had refused to let Caroline's murder remain hidden. The media attention from the trial slowly died down, but the impact continued. I was contacted by dozens of families who had experienced similar situations. Elderly relatives who had died under suspicious circumstances while in the care of family members who benefited financially. Many of these cases were too old to prosecute or lacked sufficient evidence, but the patterns were disturbing. I began working with Detective Mills and other law enforcement officials to develop training programs on recognizing elder abuse and financial exploitation. We created protocols for investigating suspicious deaths of elderly or disabled individuals, especially when significant financial interests were involved. My mother's case became a textbook example, studied in police academies and forensic programs. A year after the trial, I received a letter from Clara in prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Rachel," the letter began, "I've had time to think in here. Time to remember things I had pushed away for so many years. Your mother tried to love me, even when I was cruel to her. Even when I rejected every kindness she offered, she kept trying. She included me in family traditions, remembered my birthdays, asked about my life. I threw it all back in her face because I couldn't separate her from my father, from what he had done to my mother. I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did is unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that in her final days, your mother wasn't afraid. She was angry. She was determined. She looked my father in the eye and told him she knew what he had done to my mother. She said she would. Foundation. We funded research into elder abuse, supported legislation to strengthen protections for vulnerable adults, and provided grants to organizations that helped victims escape abusive situations. Every life we saved felt like a small victory for my mother. 2 years after her death, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder abuse and financial exploitation. I stood before an audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, healthcare providers, and family advocates, telling my mother's story. I spoke about the signs I had missed, the red flags that seemed obvious in hindsight. I talked about how abusers use family bonds and trust to isolate and control their victims. My mother's killers weren't strangers, I said. They were the people she trusted most, the people who were supposed to care for her. They used her illness as a weapon, her trust as a rule for exploitation. They isolated her from other family members, controlled her medications, managed her finances, and when she started to suspect the truth, they killed her. The audience was silent, absorbing the horror of it. During the question and answer session, someone asked what could have prevented my mother's death. Vigilance, I said. Not paranoia, but healthy skepticism when vulnerable people are completely dependent on others. Regular oversight of finances, even when family members have power of attorney. Multiple people involved in medical care, so no one person controls access to medications. And most importantly, listening when vulnerable people express fear or concern, even if their caregivers claim it's just confusion or paranoia. After the conference, I was approached by a woman named Patricia, whose elderly father had recently died. She had suspicions about her stepmother, but had been told she was just grieving and looking for someone to blame. "Your story gave me the courage to push for an autopsy," Patricia said. "They found thallium in his system. My stepmother is now under investigation. Your mother's story might have saved other lives. I heard similar stories over the years. Families who had recognized the warning signs because of what had happened to my mother. Investigations opened, crimes exposed, lives saved. My mother's death had become a catalyst for change. 3 years after the trial, I got married to James, a fellow lawyer I had met through my work with the foundation. He understood my dedication to my mother's. 2. I received word that Richard had died in prison. He had been attacked by another inmate and died from his injuries. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice, just emptiness. His death didn't bring my mother back, didn't undo the pain he had caused. Clara wrote to me after Richard's death. Her letter was different this time, more reflective. "He's gone," she wrote. "The man who made me into a monster is dead, and I feel nothing. I thought I would feel free, but I just feel empty. I've been seeing a therapist here, a good one who specializes in trauma. She's helping me understand what happened to me as a child, how witnessing my mother's murder and being raised by her killer shaped me. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. I've been thinking about your mother a lot, about the kindness I rejected, the love I couldn't accept. She knew what my father was, but she still tried to love me. That takes a special kind of person. I'm starting to understand what I took from the world when I took her from it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to become someone your mother wouldn't be ashamed of. It's too late to matter, but I'm trying. Clara." This time I did write back, briefly. "Clara, my mother would have wanted you to heal, to become better than what Richard made you. Do that. Not for my forgiveness, which I can't give, but for yourself. For the child you were before he destroyed your innocence. For the woman you might have been. Rachel." 5 years after my mother's death, the foundation had grown beyond anything I had imagined. We had chapters in 12 states, had helped hundreds of families, had successfully advocated for new laws protecting vulnerable adults. The Margaret Walsh Act, passed in our state and being considered at the federal level, required additional oversight for powers of attorney involving elderly or disabled individuals, and mandated investigations for suspicious deaths of vulnerable adults. I continued to speak at conferences, train law enforcement, and work with families. But the work that meant the most to me was the support groups we ran for family members who had lost loved ones to elder abuse. In those rooms, sharing our stories and our grief,
My mother's death found meaning. One evening, after a
Pharmacy. Richard was there, hovering, trying to rush her along. But she grabbed my hand when he wasn't looking and squeezed it so tight. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "Tell Rachel I love her. Tell her to be strong." I thought it was just the rambling of a sick woman, but now I know she was trying to say goodbye. I broke down crying right there in the empty meeting room. This stranger had given me a gift, a final message from my mother. She had been thinking of me at the end, had wanted me to know she loved me, had believed I would be strong enough to handle what was coming. 7 years after my mother's death, Maggie was old enough to understand the story of her grandmother. I told her in age-appropriate pieces about how Grandma Margaret had been brave, had stood up to bad people, had made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. "Was she a hero?" Maggie asked. "Yes," I said, "she was a hero." "Like in the movies?" "No," I said, thinking about it. "Real heroes don't always win. Sometimes they die fighting. But what makes them heroes is that they fight anyway, even when they know they might lose." Grandma Margaret knew she was in danger, but she still tried to stop the bad people, and because she did, they can't hurt anyone else. That same year, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell my mother's story as part of a larger piece about elder abuse. I agreed, with the condition that the focus would be on prevention and awareness, not sensationalism. The documentary included interviews with Detective Mills, Dr. Morrison, Diana, and several families who had been helped by the foundation. Clara, surprisingly, agreed to be interviewed from prison. Her segment was chilling and powerful, a first-hand account of how someone becomes capable of killing a family member. "I was raised by a murderer," Clara said in the interview. "He taught me that other people were just obstacles or opportunities." That family was about control, not love. By the time Margaret came into our lives, I was already broken. She tried to fix me, tried to love me, but I was too far gone. I helped kill the only person who ever really tried to be a mother to me. When asked if she had any regrets, Clara looked directly at the camera. "Every day, every single day," Grown taller over the decade. "Tell us about Grandma Margaret," Thomas said, even though he had heard the stories many times. So I told them again about my mother's courage, her determination, her love. I told them about how she had discovered a terrible secret and refused to let it stay hidden, how she had gathered evidence even as she was dying, how she had trusted me to finish what she started. "She sounds amazing," Maggie said. "She was," I agreed. But she was also just a normal person who chose to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous. That's what real courage is. As we were leaving the cemetery, we passed another funeral in progress. A family gathered around a grave, grieving their loss. I thought about Clara's words at my mother's funeral 10 years ago. "We're finally rid of her." Words meant to hurt, to show victory. But Clara had been wrong. We weren't rid of my mother. Her influence lived on in the foundation, in the laws that had been changed, in the lives that had been saved. Every person who recognized the signs of elder abuse because of her story, every family that sought help because of what happened to her, every investigation opened because of the protocols developed after her case, all of that was my mother's legacy. Richard was dead. Clara was in prison, broken and remorseful. But my mother's impact continued to grow. She had won a victory that her killers never saw coming, a triumph that extended far beyond justice for her own murder. 15 years after my mother's death, Maggie was preparing for college. She had decided to study law, inspired by the work of the foundation and her grandmother's story. "I want to help people like Grandma Margaret did," she told me. "I want to make sure no one else goes through what she went through." I was proud of her decision, though part of me wished she could have a career untouched by the tragedy that had shaped our family. But Maggie had grown up attending foundation events, meeting survivors, hearing their stories. She understood that fighting injustice was a calling, not just a job. That same year, Clara was up for parole. To my surprise, she didn't attend her hearing. "I've refused parole," she wrote to me.
I'm not ready to be free. I've found purpose here, working in the prison library.
A national organization with a permanent staff, helping thousands of families each year. The Margaret Walsh Act was passed at the federal level, providing protections for vulnerable adults across the country. My mother's name appears in law books, medical journals, and training manuals. Maggie is a prosecutor now, specializing in elder abuse cases. She's fierce and brilliant, carrying on her grandmother's fight for justice. Thomas is in medical school, planning to specialize in geriatric care. He wants to protect vulnerable patients from medical exploitation. Both of my children have found their own ways to honor their grandmother's memory. James and I have grown older together, our hair graying, lines forming around our eyes. We've built a good life, filled with love and purpose, though the shadow of my mother's murder never completely fades. There are still moments when I pick up the phone to call her, forgetting for an instant that she's gone. Still times when I see something that would make her laugh and feel the sharp pain of her absence. Diana passed away 5 years ago at the age of 82. Before she died, she told me she could finally rest peacefully, knowing that both Caroline and my mother had received justice. She left her estate to the foundation, along with all of Caroline's belongings she had saved. Among them was a letter Caroline had written but never sent, planning to leave Richard and start a new life with Clara. It was heartbreaking to read about her hopes and dreams, knowing how it would end. Clara is still in prison. She's 53 now and has become something of a mentor to younger inmates. She teaches literacy classes, helps with legal research, and by all accounts has genuinely transformed herself. She still writes to me occasionally, though I rarely respond. Her letters are thoughtful, reflective, showing a depth of understanding about her crimes that Richard never achieved. In her most recent letter, she wrote, "I've been thinking about forgiveness lately. Not asking for it, but understanding it. Your mother would have forgiven me. Not because I deserved it, but because that's who she was. She would have seen the broken child inside the monster and felt compassion. I'm trying to learn to be like that, to find compassion for others despite their flaws. It's the only way I can honor her memory." Standing at my mother's grave on the 20th anniversary of her death, I'm surrounded by people whose lives she touched. Families saved by the foundation, seeking justice for a woman she never met, Maggie says. She paid the ultimate price for refusing to let evil go unchallenged, but her death was not a defeat. It was the beginning of a movement that has saved countless lives. Every person here is proof that my grandmother won, that good won, that love and justice are stronger than hate and greed. As the gathering disperses, I stay behind with my family. The cemetery is peaceful again, just us and the memories. I think about Clara's words 20 years ago. We're finally rid of her. How wrong she had been. My mother's influence has only grown stronger with time. Her story is taught in universities, her case cited in courtrooms, her name invoked whenever someone fights for justice for the vulnerable. She has become immortal in a way her killers never imagined possible. Clara thought they were rid of my mother. But you can't get rid of someone whose courage inspires others. You can't erase someone whose sacrifice saves lives. You can't defeat someone who wins by losing, who achieves justice through injustice, who finds victory in apparent defeat. My mother knew she might die. She knew Richard and Clara were dangerous, but she also knew that truth has a way of surfacing, that justice delayed is not always justice denied. She trusted me to finish what she started, and in doing so, she ensured that her death would mean something. 20 years later, my mother is more present in the world than she was in her final years of life. Her influence reaches into courtrooms, hospitals, nursing homes, and family homes across the country. Every vulnerable person protected by the laws passed in her name, every family saved by recognizing the warning signs, every criminal caught because of investigative protocols developed from her case, all of that is my mother living on. Clara said they were finally rid of her. But my mother is still here, in every life saved, every justice served, every truth revealed. She's in Maggie's fierce advocacy for victims, in Thomas's compassionate care for elderly patients, in the thousands of people who have found courage in her story. We're not rid of her. We never will be.
and that is her greatest victory of all.